I have a question for you, and it's one of those teacher things where I'm actually looking for an answer. What can we do to be saved? What can you do? Like, what action can you commit to be saved? What? Believe. Can you, pray enough or, read enough or, jump through enough hoops, Diana? None. Nothing. There's nothing you can do apart from Christ to be saved. Correct? We're all in agreement on that, yes? Okay. The problem is, I think we all know that, and if you were walking down the street and somebody handed you a microphone and asked you that, I think that's what we would all say, is no, there's nothing we can do outside of Christ to be saved. We say that and we know that, but I think sometimes we forget that, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. When I read the Bible, more often than not, the way that I read it is I just read my favorite books, and then when I get done reading one of my favorite books, I pray and I ask God, what should I read next? So I'll find myself reading James, which I've probably read far more than any other book in the Bible. I just love James. But I'll get done reading James, and I'll be like, God, what do you want me to read next? And lately, within the past year or 2 years, I feel like God always tells me, go back and read the Gospels. And I'm like, okay. So I started reading the Gospel, and then I'll read the Gospels, and then I'll go read Deuteronomy, which, I'm a list rules person. I love Deuteronomy. They're like, you find a dead body out in the middle of the desert, you do this to the closest town, whoever's closest, you're in trouble. That's who pays for it. I love that. I love rules. I love regulations. I love it. Until I don't think they make sense. Brie will make fun of me. She's like, why didn't you stop at that stop sign? I'm like, it doesn't really count. I love rules if they make sense to me. If they don't, I'm like, it's just a suggestion, But anyway, so then I'll read Deuteronomy, and I'm like, God, what do you want me to read now? And he'd be like, go back and read the Gospels again. And I was like, okay, I'll read the Gospels again, I'll get through there. And then what I noticed, because I felt I recognized this pattern of God telling me to go back and read Gospels over and over and over again. And I was in that mindset, the first couple of times you're like, okay, I've read this, I get it. But then I started realizing he's giving me new revelation every time I read the Gospels. Because although none of the words in this book change and we never add to or take away from this book, we should be changing, and God is transforming us as we grow with him. And so through that growth, when we read his word, we gain new understanding. And so as I'm reading through the Gospels in my most recent time, one thing that's always stuck out to me is Jesus' relationship with the Pharisees. And the Pharisees are kind of like the Darth Vader of the New Testament, right? They're like the bad guys. They're the scapegoat. They're the ones who got Jesus crucified. But as I was reading through my most recent time, I landed in Mark, and I was going, but how did they get there? Because if we think back to ancient times, even for them, God established temple leadership with the Levites. He wants there to be people who are religious leaders amongst the Jewish people. So God established it. Fast forward to Jesus' time, we have the Pharisees who are so blind and stuck in their legalism that they miss the Messiah. So, how did we go from God establishing this leadership to the leadership ultimately being corrupt and missing out on the one thing they were supposed to see? So that's what we're going to look at today. And just to give really brief, surface level history, we're not going to go in super depth, but understanding where the Pharisees even came from. So when the Jews were exiled to Babylon, they obviously couldn't be at the temple, right? And so a lot of these religious leaders, or the ones who had remembered the law, started becoming kind of like mini priests or rabbis, right? They start teaching orally. So they remember all of the laws, they remember all of these traditions, and they start teaching people orally, and they start developing synagogues, or more or less what we would call house churches. And so you start having all of these little rabbis pop up everywhere. And so then when they were allowed to go back to Jerusalem, you already had this synagogue style, multiple rabbis teaching, and that's how more or less the Pharisees developed. They were really just a group of people who had memorized the law, who had memorized these traditions, and became religious leaders in the community. And then they split. Kind of like how Christian denominations split over different things. They started splitting with multiple groups, but the two that we really know that are focused on in the New Testament are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the thing that divided them was that the Sadducees only looked to the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. They only read the Torah. That was their guiding principle for life. The Pharisees, however, took the Torah as well as the writings called the Mishnah and the Talmud, which are basically like a culmination of like proverbs, of rules, of traditions, of commentaries on the Torah. And they also made that part of their religious practice. So a lot of these things are like washing your hands before you eat, washing them a certain way before you eat, the way you conduct yourself in temple, the days that you fast, not mixing, we see in the Torah, not mixing milk with beef and stuff like that. They took it even a step further, and you don't touch it and da-da-da. So they come up with all these rules and regulations. So the Sadducees and the Pharisees kind of split on that, because the Pharisees are very strict to the text, and the Sadducees are very strict to the text. The Pharisees start developing all these oral traditions and stuff. The thing about that is when you have all of these like regulations and the way you do things, it's easy to measure how holy you are. Because they're like, oh, I wash my hands before every meal. I noticed you didn't wash your hands yesterday. You're not as holy as me. Did you see the way I was walking through the market and I didn't touch any of the unclean fruit? I had servants do that for me. I'm far more holy than you because I don't touch unclean stuff. Or, did you see the way that I tithed in the temple? Did you see me coming up there, that giant bag of money, and the way that I dropped it down? I'm far more holy than you. So they start developing these actions that show their holiness. And that's where they get in trouble. They've spent all this time looking for the Messiah, but in the midst of it, they've concerned themselves far more with the letter of the law than with the heart of the law. And that's where we see them having conflict with Jesus. So let's look in Mark 7, 1 through 13. One day, some Pharisees and teachers of religious law arrived from Jerusalem to see Jesus. They noticed that some of his disciples failed to follow the Jewish ritual of hand washing before eating. The Jews, especially the Pharisees, did not eat until they had poured water over their cupped hands as required by their ancient traditions. Just pause there before we move on. There is a story of a Jewish leader who was imprisoned by the Romans, and the Romans bring him like a bowl of water, and they bring him a bowl of food. And rather than drinking the water, he would use that water to ceremoniously clean his hands before he ate. Well, he ended up dying because he refused to drink water. And so he was touted as this great martyr because it was like, look how closely he cared about the law, to where he used the water to clean his hands rather than drink it. That's ridiculous. Like, that is not what God's expectation is for us, is like, yes, I will die because my hands are clean while I eat, but my body perishes. Like, where does that make sense? But that's how far down the road they are into this like religious legalism and like works salvation kind of thing. So we keep going. Similarly, they don't eat anything from the market until they immerse their hands in water. This is but one of the many traditions they have clung to, such as their ceremonial washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and the teachers of religious law asked him, "Why don't your disciples follow our age-old traditions? They eat without first performing the hand-washing ceremony." Jesus replied, "You hypocrites! Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you, for he wrote, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Your worship is a farce, for they teach man-made ideas as commands from God.'" Jesus is saying, all these traditions you've come up with have nothing to do with Scripture. You've made all this up, and now this has become the law that you follow. Then he stated, "You skillfully sidestep God's law in order to hold on to your own tradition. For instance, Moses gave you this law from God: honor your mother and father. And anyone who speaks disrespectfully of mother and father must be put to death. But you say it is all right for people to say to their parents, 'Sorry, I can't help you, for I have vowed to give to God what would be given to you.' In this way, you let them disregard their needy parents, and so you cancel the word of God in order to hand down your own tradition." And this is just one example among many. Jesus is saying to them, so the God-given law was to respect and take care of your parents. You, well-intentioned, which we have to remember this, like the Pharisees are the bad guys in the New Testament. All of this started with good intentions. Like they wanted to maintain the law. They wanted to maintain these traditions while they were exiled, but they got so tied up in the power struggle of being so religiously connected to the law that they missed out on the heart. So anyway, Jesus is saying, the law says, honor your father and mother and take care of them, but you've come up with this tradition, well-intentioned, that says, everything I have belongs to God. That's a good intention thing to say, right? Like, that's true, right? Everything we have belongs to God. But the way they weaponize that is to say, oh, my parents are in need and are asking me for money or asking me for personal care. And you go, rather than, yes, I'll take care of you, you go, sorry, everything I have belongs to God. So I can't possibly take that from God to give to you. They've completely negated the heart of the law by sticking to this tradition that they've made up. And not to mention, they do it when they please. It's when it's convenient for them, right? It's funny. And then we see Jesus come in conflict with them again in Mark 2, 23 through 28. On the Sabbath day, Jesus was walking through some grain fields. His disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. I don't know if any of you have seen like grain in a field. It's about that long. The grains are tiny. It's a seed, right? And so they start breaking off the little heads and eating the grain. But the Pharisees say to Jesus, look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath? The law says you should not do work, right? It's trying to keep them from doing work on the Sabbath. And what the Pharisees are saying is, look, they're working on the Sabbath by breaking off a little seed. The massive evil Knievel jump from don't do work to you can't pick off a seed and eat it on the Sabbath is ridiculous. They have come so down to again, the letter of the law rather than the heart of the law that they're harvesting, having a bunch of people out in a field with scythes, cutting grain and gathering it into the barn, is equated with breaking off a piece because you're hungry and you just happen to be walking by. And Jesus is like, you guys are ridiculous. He says, haven't you ever read in the scriptures when David did, when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God during the days when Abiathar was high priest and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread only set aside for the priests. He also gave some to his companions. And then Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of the people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So David, eating the showbread inside the temple, huge no-no. But he was coming back from battle with his dudes. They were starving. The quickest access to food was the bread in the temple. And so David said, yeah, I know there's bread in there. I'm going to go eat it. And guess what? That's fine. God is saying, I'm not so religiously offended that, how dare you eat the showbread from the temple? Do you think God, needs the bread? Do you think that, he's counting these loaves as if he needs access to this bread? He's not offended. And Jesus goes on to say, the Sabbath was made for us, not for us to meet the requirements. It's not like God came up with the Sabbath to say, oh, yeah, one day in particular, they have even more strict rules to follow. This will be really fun. And so he's saying, no, I made the Sabbath so you'll stop working for a moment and just reflect on me. Even as God rested as he created the world, he's saying even you should rest from your work. He made all these laws about work, not so that you could be how could I figure out how to do this or how do I figure out how to get around it? He's saying, I'm giving you this so that you'll take a moment and stop. If anything, it's a gift to us to say, I don't have any expectation for you to work. As a matter of fact, my expectations for you to work are so low, I'm commanding you not to, because that's how important your rest and communion with me is. You must take a break from your work. Otherwise, you're going to continuously strive and get in this cycle of my works determine my salvation, and you turn into a Pharisee. If you refuse to rest the way that I've commanded, you just become a works-based Pharisee. And so we see, again, further, Matthew 22, 36 through 40, the Pharisees, again, they're so blind to what Jesus is trying to teach them that they're just constantly trying to poke holes in what he's saying to them. So they're trying to catch him in lies. And they say, teacher, what is the greatest commandment of the law? And what they're asking him is of the 66 or 68 commandments there are, which one of those is the most important? Which is funny because they've already kind of made their own laws. Anyway, but so they're asking Jesus, which one of those is the most important then if, you're so wise and everything? And Jesus, rather than falling into their trap and saying, oh, this law or this law or this law, what he does is he responds in a way that sums up the heart of the entire law. He says, the most important one is love the Lord your God with all of your heart and all of your soul and all in your mind. And if that's not good enough, the second one is love your neighbor as yourself, which must have been a giant smack to the Pharisees' face, because what they want to hear is washing your hands before you eat, making sure you tithe this much in the temple, making sure that you're there every Sunday, making sure that you prophesy. They're looking to be told that they are following the law so well. And Jesus is saying, all of this that you're asking me, you're missing the point. Love God and love other people, which you know you're not doing. You know you're not doing. You're neglecting your father and mother so that you can say that you're going to control your money because you are actually your own God. You're not concerned with loving God because you have become your own God in this situation. And what's crazy about all of this is, like, again, we talk about going back in time and seeing where the God established the temple at the beginning, and he's establishing these religious leaders with good intentions. But before he does, we look at Deuteronomy 1 through 2. I feel like God should have highlighted this or something to them. He says, Deuteronomy 4, 1 through 2, and now, Israel, listen carefully. He's about to give them the law. This is right before. He says, listen carefully to these decrees and regulations that I'm about to teach you. Obey them. Why? So that you may live. Not so that I can catch you in doing them wrong. Not so that I can keep a tally of you failing, but so that you can live. Sorry. So you may enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. Do not add to or subtract from these commands I am giving you. Don't do that. Just obey the commands of the Lord. And again, I think well-intentioned Jews heard that and said, yes, that's what we're doing. And we get caught up in this keeping the law, becoming an exercise in measurement. Who keeps it better? Because how else do we we make ourselves feel better? I come to church every Sunday and I know they weren't here last week. I'm probably more holy than them. Obviously. Did you hear how loudly I was singing during worship? On pitch. Far more holy than you. I can hear you back there. Miss one note. It's like we get caught up in these things that we can tick off and say, yep, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. This shows that I'm far more holy than others, right? But the Pharisees have missed the forest for the trees. They're so much more concerned with following the law that the Messiah is staring them in the face I'm right here. And they're like, yeah, but what's the greatest commandment? And he's like, are you kidding me right now? Look at me. I'm here to save you. I'm what you've been looking for. But you're far more concerned with these traditions you've come up with. You've neglected what's actually here to save you. It's a funny story. There's a guy, he's coming over the border. There's a guy he's a border patrol agent between Mexico and the U.S. And there's a guy, he's riding a bicycle up to the border, and he's got 2 bags hanging from his handlebars. He gets to the border, and the guy's like, all right, what you got in these bags? And the guy's like, sand. He's like, sand? He's like, mm-hmm. He goes, yeah, right. Okay. So he opens them up. Sure enough, there's sand in there. He's like, okay. Starts digging around. He's like, feels like sand. He's like, just to make sure. He dumps it out, spreads it out on the ground. He's like, these are just bags of sand. And the guy's like, yeah, I know. I told you. He's like, okay. Why do you have sand? He's like, just 'cause. He's like, okay. So guy leaves, comes back the next day, coming the other direction. Bicycle, 2 bags. Guy's like, what's in the bags? He's like, sand. It's like, okay, what is this guy? So he opens it up, sure enough, digs it around, pours it out. It's sand. He's like, what is going on here? He's like, I'm just taking sand, He's like, okay, whatever. Next day, comes by again. Guy pulls up. He's like, let me guess. And he goes, sand. He goes, yeah, I figured. Okay, cool. And he digs in the bag. There's just sand. And this goes on for a year. And the guy's kind of just tired of it. He sees him every day. He's the sandbag guy. Rides his bike up with 2 bags of sand, drives through, doesn't really understand what's going on, but he's like, whatever. He's not breaking the law as far as I can tell. Let him go. Well, a year goes by. The guy goes into a bar, and he sees Sandbag Man. And he walks up to him, and he's like, all right, level with me. I'm not at work. I'm not wearing a badge right now. We both know you're smuggling something, and I just couldn't figure out. Come on. Right? Level with me. Tell me what you were smuggling. The guy's like, bicycles. Dude is so caught up in this paranoia of these bags, he's missed the fact he's got red bike, blue bike, yellow bike, purple bike. Man's just pulling bicycles back and forth every single day, making so much money by distracting him with sand. And that's what the Pharisees have done. The Pharisees have become so obsessed with the bags of sand, they've missed the bicycle. Jesus is like, I'm right here. And you can't even see me because you're so worried about your religious order and everything, right? And so as I looked at this and I started thinking about this and how the Pharisees went from well-intentioned all the way to being so blind they don't see the Pharisees or they don't see Jesus, I started asking myself, am I doing that? Are we doing that? Because I know, again, we like to look at the Pharisees and be like, they're the bad guys. Like, we would never do that. Every time we read the Bible, right? Like, we're Jesus or like we're one of the disciples. Like, yeah. When in reality, far often than not, we're probably the Pharisees. Or maybe we're those, the Gentiles asking for him to be crucified. Like, we like to put ourselves in the position of the hero. But I think it's healthy for us sometimes to reflect and be like, man, am I? Am I pharisaical? Am I doing things that are making me more religious than loving? And so I started looking at I literally Googled modern signs of pharisaical behavior. And it was I found, multiple websites with lists and lists of stuff. But ultimately, after I read through it, I narrowed it down to 3 things. And one of them is, you believe showing up for worship every Sunday makes you right with God. You think that your attendance is what determines your salvation. And we see in Ephesians 4, 17 through 24, it says, with the Lord's authority, I say this, live no longer as the Gentiles do, for they are hopelessly confused. Their minds are full of darkness. They wander far from life that God gives them because they have closed their minds and hardened their hearts against him. They have no sense of shame. They live for lustful pleasure and eagerly seek every kind of impurity. But that isn't what you learned about Christ. Since you have heard about Jesus and have learned the truth that comes from him, throw off your old sinful nature and your former way, which is corrupted by lust and deception. Instead, let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes. Put on your new nature, created to be like God, truly righteous and holy. If we think that our act as a Christian is to accept God and then show up at church, we've missed it. It says right here, let the Spirit renew. That verb is like an active verb. That means it's happening right now. It's not a one-time thing. Your salvation is not like flicking a light switch. Your salvation is more like a walk. That's why they call it the way and the walk, right? It's a process. When we accept to follow Jesus, it's not like I'm in or I'm out. It's more like we're walking down a path and Jesus says, I want you to go this way instead of this way. And by choosing to walk that way, we slowly become more like him, understand him more. But if we say, yeah, I like this Jesus thing, but I'm going to try to wade in the middle of the path through the wilderness, you find yourself covered in briars, cut up, lost, confused. And so if you're finding yourself in church and you've been in church for years and you're just I don't get it. I'm not really affected by all this. I have to ask you, is your heart hardened? Are you allowing God to change who you are, or are you just showing up expecting your attendance to get you into heaven? And it's not about your salvation is not in question. If you accepted Jesus, you are saved. But what God has commanded us to do is there's something to be done with your salvation. Your works should be evident of your faith. Your works do not make your faith. If you have works, that should be evidence of you growing in faith. But if all you have is work and your faith is dead, that's nothing. You're a whitewashed tomb. That's what Jesus calls the Pharisees. You look pretty on the outside, but you're dead on the inside. Your attendance does not determine your transformation. And so point number 2, you spend more time talking about what you are against, not what you are for. Don't get me started on politics. Don't get me started on modern church. As somebody who spent a good deal of my life as an atheist, let me tell you the craziest thing to me about modern church. So I became a Christian, and I start learning about all these denominations, which when I was a kid, we were Lutheran, and I remember hearing about Lutherans, and then I start learning about Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians, and I start looking at there's hundreds of them, and I start to ask and I'm asking my mentor at the time why do we have so many different denominations? And he's like, well, some of them believe once saved, always saved. Some of them believe you have to be sprinkled. Others believe you have to be dipped. And so I'm going, hold on. As somebody, again, who saw Christians as just this one big group, you're telling me Jesus commanded you to go into the world and make disciples of the nations, and you guys are getting upset of whether or not you get wet up here or all over? I'm sorry. I misunderstand that. I do not understand. And so if we're sitting in here and we're saying that we are this, but we're not that. Yeah, we're not Presbyterians. Certainly not United Methodists. Absolutely not. Is that really how we define ourselves? How about we are Christians and the followers of Jesus? And that's all we need to say about it. Our church doors should not look like gates with like a passcode. It shouldn't be doors to a country club. Just because somebody looks different than you or acts different than you or believes different than you, you know what that's called? Opportunity. We welcome them in so that we can teach them about Jesus. We don't keep them out and say, you don't really meet the standard that we have set. Once you figure that out, then you can come back and you can come worship with us. Ridiculous. And so we see that there's a long-standing tradition, and again, this is not like all Jews, this is not all Jews in ancient times, but this was a long-standing tradition that Jewish men would start their morning prayer by saying, "Thank you, God, that I was not born a Gentile, a woman, or a slave." To a devout Jewish man, all three groups were suspect, subordinate, and second class. And into that context, Jesus enters into the first century world speaking with, teaching, healing, and eating with women, Gentiles, and slaves. His followers eventually came to realize that these were not one-off isolated events, but rather God's intention to widely and fully accept all people into his kingdom. It is not our job to determine who gets accepted into the kingdom or not. That is Jesus' job. Stop doing Jesus' job. Your job is to spread the word of Christ and let God do the work. Plant the seed, he will water, let it grow. Okay? We got to stop keeping people out because they don't fit our tradition or like they don't worship the way that we do or like, people show up here and they're like, drums? Absolutely not. Like, first off, Moises is incredible. Abraham is incredible at drums. So yeah, wherever you are, Moises, where are you, Abraham? But also like, why are we dividing over like, well, we don't like loud music and like we wear pantyhose and you don't? Like, who cares? Like, who cares? Jesus says nothing about that. And so finally, the third point of evidence of modern pharisaical behavior is you don't repent of sin because you don't have any serious sin to repent of. There's a famous line in the Bible where Jesus tells the Pharisees, "You'll strain a gnat but swallow a camel." And what he means by that is like the Pharisees were because a gnat and camels were both considered unclean. You could not eat them. You would be breaking religious law. So what the Pharisees would do is they would have like a piece of cloth, and they would pour their water into their cup through the cloth, just in case there was a fly or a gnat or anything, so that they didn't drink it and break religious law, right? So they're super concerned about this tiny little gnat entering their system, but at the same time, they will turn around and do the equivalent of swallowing a camel by hearing the cries of their parents asking for help and going, "Oh, nope, sorry. All that I have belongs to God. Can't give anything to you." How can you be so concerned with the gnat, yet turn around and swallow the camel and still consider yourself righteous? That's what Jesus is saying is like, you think, you tell yourself like, it's just a small sin. It's not a big sin. I haven't killed anybody. First off, most people know sin is sin. God says so. Also, why would you entertain the idea of justifying sin, big or small? Because when we start justifying sin and we're saying like a really easy one just comes to mind is like watching porn. You're like, it doesn't hurt anybody else. I'm not hurting anybody else. First off, think about the porn industry and what you're like feeding into. So I'd argue you are hurting other people and possibly human trafficking as well. But two, you want to pretend that it's just you, right? I'm not hurting anybody else. So that puts you in a position to say, I hear what you say, God. I hear that you're telling me this is a sin. I shouldn't do this. I shouldn't lust. And then my rebuttal to that is, yeah, I'm going to say it's okay for me, though. I'm going to make myself a little bit more closer to you and say, I hear your law as the God of the universe, and I'm going to say, my translation's better. My iteration's better. That's exactly where the Pharisees found themselves and going, yeah, we hear that, but we think that we've figured it out a little bit better than you have. I was hanging out, had lunch with a friend of mine last week who's going through a terrible time. Hey, if you're watching, I won't say his name, but I know he's watching. I love you, man. And so we're talking about verses that like keep us going in the midst of trials and everything. And he was sharing some verses with me, and I was sharing one with him. And I said, man, the one verse that I cling to that keeps me going is actually probably the most terrifying verse in the Bible. It's the scariest thing to read. And he was like, okay, what is it? I was like, Matthew 7:21 through 23. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons, and done many other wonders? Lord, did we not attend church? Did we not tithe? Did we not attend the community event? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, for you practice lawlessness. Can you imagine living your entire life, ticking the boxes? I attended church. I read my Bible every once in a while. I tithed. I attended the community event. And you get to heaven and you're like, God, what's up? I did all the things. And he goes, who are you? I have no idea who you are. All of those acts you did for your own glory, for your own self, and your heart has been hardened. We have not had a relationship in I don't know how long. That's terrifying. And ultimately, if it should be terrifying to the Pharisees, knowing that that's exactly where they're headed. But the beautiful thing is, God is not saying, keep that heaviness, keep that hopelessness, keep that fear, because that's what's going to motivate you to do the right thing. No, because that's still works-based righteousness. Instead, he gives us a different kind of hope. Bree and I are at Carolina Creek this weekend playing worship for family camp. And originally, Hezi, our son, was going to come with us. But we decided cousins, so we dropped him off at Grandma and Grandpa's, and we go to family camp. So we play worship Friday night, and we get off stage, and we're sitting in the chairs or whatever, and there's little kids running everywhere. It's like ants in an ant farm. But one in particular is running around the row that we're sitting on, and it doesn't help that he's really blonde and pale and kind of chunky. And so we're just looking at him, and Bree and I just look at him, and we just both start crying. And in the middle of Al's down here speaking, we're just watching kids run around, and we're crying. And we're crying because I'm like, man, I just miss my son. I know he's okay. I know he's with his grandparents, but man, I just miss my son. I just want him to be here with me. And when I'm thinking about that, I'm not thinking to myself, man, I miss my son, but I hate when he smacks me in the face while we're playing too rough. Or I hate when he's disobedient and doesn't listen to me. Or when, we have to go back in his room for the 8th time because he screams and yells in his bed and he's telling us, you got to tell me goodnight the right way. I'm not thinking about all these things that frustrate me or thinking about all these things that he, quote unquote, does wrong. I'm just wanting to be with him. I just want to be with my son. And that's the way God sees us. As much as you think that he's standing up there looking down at you like, oh, you pathetic. You're kidding me, right? He's looking at us being like, I just want you to be with me. I gave you this law so that we could be close, so that you don't seek comfort in these other things. I'm not giving you this law so that you can have these set of rules to pat yourself on the back and say, look, I've done it. He's saying, I gave you this so that we can remain close, and you've missed it. And yet, even when we repent and we start walking that road back towards him, full of shame and full of sorrow, he's not standing there tapping his foot like, here he comes. He is sprinting down the road towards us so that he can hug us, kiss us, put a ring on our finger, a robe on our back, and say, I'm so glad my child is home. I don't care what you've done or where you've been. I just want you to be home. The law was not there for us to keep. The Sabbath and the law were put there to bring us closer to God, to show the love he has for us, not to create this weird Tetris game of can we figure it out. The law is there to keep us safe and for us to be in communion with him. He doesn't care how many times you've messed up. He just wants you to come home.